We are live. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It is morning here where I am. I got my coffee here, and I'm super excited to go. We have an amazing keynote presentation here with Kelly Peters from BEworks. It's going to be an amazing time. I'm going to bring Kelly up here. Here we go. Good morning, Kelly. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm super excited. Is it morning where you're at too?
Yes, it is. I'm in Toronto.
Oh, sweet. Yeah, so I'm not too far from you. Yeah, but we have like a decentralized conference this time. So we have people tuning in from all around the world. So let me know, folks, in the chat where you're tuning in from as you trickle in here. I'm gonna just have a little conversation with Kelly while we wait for people to join in, and then I'll make myself scarce and you can hear the amazing talk that Kelly's got planned for us. Okay, so Kelly, I was doing a little bit of research and I saw that you worked for some big traditional banks. And I was wondering, like, how you came into the blockchain space, around about when. Did you ever think it was a scam? And yeah, it's a big packed question, but let's hear what your journey was like coming from bank to blockchain.
From bank to blockchain. So I'm one of those folks who came to blockchain from that libertarian philosophy perspective. I'm one of those. I'm one of those who believed in the idea of decentralization and think that there's just so much to unpack when it comes to understanding who we trust. And privacy and security are so incredibly important, yet so difficult for us to act on. And decentralization and the blockchain technology provides a solution that doesn't require a fundamental change in behavior if you kind of switch to that platform. That said, there's still a ton of change that has to be undertaken by the individual, especially since not everybody, thinks about security and privacy and, the risk of centralized resources the way that the incredible blockchain community does. So I hope that what I think about can maybe start to help bridge that gap. So one of the things that you were curious about was, well, what about that banker perspective? So where I come from was, I was in the .com world in the early 90s, starting in 1993. I was an internet consultant. I had been using technology and internet-based technologies through the 80s. So I kind of been at this stuff for a while. I've been at the place where you guys are at right now, which is this really tough slog of building things and trying to get financing for it and trying to get users and trying to build sustainable business models. And so I really appreciate what you're going through right now. I went through that in the 90s with the internet space. And, we had these terms, right? Like cyberspace and information superhighway that were these terms that were trying to help people understand why the internet was going to be amazing. And the World Wide Web came along and helped create that interface where you didn't have to understand hypertext and what was so magical and powerful about hypertext to be able to get why this technology is so powerful. I had read a book called Hypertext. I think it was written in the 1950s. And I loved that book because in it, he had conceptualized, imagine being able to read something and then, at points of interest, have it sort of click and then another book loads up. And whether it's an interpretation or a definition of something, or maybe even being able to, to layer on your own impressions, all of that was conceptually manifest. And it took, decades later before physicists kind of figured out, hey, we need this tool to exchange information. Even though the academics and the scientists were using and had built this World Wide Web, it wasn't until companies like Zima Beer and these guys got on that actually helped the World Wide Web become as popular as it is today. But fast forward, I was in the banking world helping build the .com for BMO. How do we put mortgages online? How do we build online banking? uh, I, I impressed you with the fact that I was the one who had the Yahoo Canada server on a dolly and plugged it in for the first time.
You gave us Yahoo Canada.
Claim to fame. I plugged in Yahoo Canada. So back then, like we were dealing with first of all really fundamental adoption issues of this technology going mainstream. We were post sort of the personal computing and now trying to bring in distributed communications. In the banking world, I felt really lucky. When I met the folks at Bank of Montreal, and I joined Bank of Montreal through meeting with an executive named Dave Ravel, who had worked under he's CIO now of one of the banks, and at the time he was working for the CIO of Bank of Montreal, Lloyd Darlington. And Lloyd Darlington and Dave Ravel, I was one of these kind of .com people, in my mid-20s, full of the piss and vinegar and confidence that you are, when you're in your mid-20s, you have this incredible energy. And I was like, you guys, you think you're all bricks and mortar, but really it's about zeros and ones. And until you get that you're just in the business of shipping zeros and ones around the world, like, you're doomed to fail. And they were like, you're hired. And I was like, really? I just told you your business model is like dinosaurs and you're all going to die. Well, I didn't really fully appreciate who I was talking to. And Dave Ravel and Lloyd Darlington happened to be banking executives who believed very much in the premise of zeros and ones. And they worked to build the bank around that. So at that time, like I was already tasked with looking at things like, what is digital currency? But this was 1998, 1999. We didn't really have an answer, but I was looking around for it. And at the time, there were some new startups. There was a white paper written by this fellow, Satoshi Nakamura. There were some really interesting folks developing digital money. We were looking at, PayPal had started to emerge. So the banking world from BMO's perspective was this is inevitable. This will happen. It's just a matter of when. Now, I had been in the publishing world. Remember, I said Yahoo Canada. Well, Yahoo Canada, Chatelaine magazine, which is like this lovely women's interest magazine, Financial Post. These, Maclean's, these were the publications that I had worked for putting .com. I was the project manager, webmaster, if you guys have heard of that horrible title. That's what I did. Well, that was this transition of, and I know that so many of you guys are thinking about this. This is like, we're fundamentally disrupting an entire industry, from Gutenberg to .com. But what was missing was a payment mechanism. And so as hard as we worked building these incredible digital media publications, at the time the publisher for Chatelaine was like, I want to extend the kitchen table conversation to the web so that we can help, raise the issues around women's issues, drive awareness, increase that conversation, across the country, not just at your table. Like, that's beautiful stuff, right? But how is she going to monetize that? So people weren't buying monthly subscriptions or buying an issue of the magazine. And that's what we struggled with. And so I was looking for a micropayment solution in 1995, and we didn't have one. And we still don't. So when Ethereum was born, for me, this was the promise. And when Bitcoin was born, this for me was the promise of finally we have digital money. Now, we don't have micropayments yet as a mainstream solution, but I am so happy because now I know somebody probably here is working on it. And my friends at Chatelaine, our journalists, our writers will actually finally, we might finally be able to bring quality journalism back and to realize the dreams of those writers, those journalists, those editors from back in the 90s with what we're doing here. So I've always kind of been on this I need a cryptocurrency micropayment solution. I need alternative mechanisms for banking. That's the world that I've been in. So I'm super happy to share some of the stuff that I've got around behavioral economics with your team today.
That's amazing. I love hearing that story. It's such like an amazing like journey from Yahoo and banking and working with Chatelaine to like this need of micropayments. And here we are today on the cusp of this new kind of revolution. That's super, super cool. So I think we're going to jump into your presentation in just a second. But for those of you that just joined in, I want to draw your attention down to the bottom of the screen. We have an Ask a Question button there. If anything comes up, you want to know or ask a deeper question to Kelly, please use that button there so it doesn't get lost in the chat. And we will have a Q&A period at the end. And right beside that, you'll notice a polls button. We've got a couple polls up for you, and I already see some answers coming in. So the first question here is, have you ever heard of behavioral economics before? We have a 14% yes and an 85% no. So we're gonna give you a crash course today.
Absolutely.
On behavioral economics, and you're gonna get to know. And I asked, have you ever heard of a nudge before? Have you ever used a nudge before? A resounding 100% no. Have you ever read the book Predictably Irrational? Again, a bunch of no's, but we have a bunch of people going out to grab that book today. So that's great news there. We'll check back in on these afterwards, and everybody can change their vote to yes after for have they heard of behavioral economics before after this talk. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Kelly Peters. She is the CEO and co-founder of BEworks, the world's leading behavioral economics firm, one of the largest employers of psychologists in the private sector. Kelly developed the BEworks Method, a proprietary framework which fuses behavioral insights with the scientific method. And she has also developed courses and programs to teach organizations and the fundamentals of behavioral science. So I'd like everyone to give a nice digital hand clap for Kelly Peters as she takes over the cast and gives us a lovely talk today about behavioral economics. Thank you, Kelly.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I'm really excited to be here. I love what you guys are doing. I think that blockchain is the next big revolution that our world needs. I see it as providing a foundation for transforming society and the economy. So I feel like the work that I have to do today is kind of intense. So as I've been working through my talk for you guys, I've really had that I've had that in mind. For those of you who are familiar with behavioral economics, I hope that I'm adding some either frameworks or some substance that you haven't yet heard before, and I'm hoping that you are in a position to help evangelize this way of thinking and this knowledge. So I hope that the talk that's here is just as relevant to you as those who are new. So I think the first thing I want to establish is that this is very much a first principles talk, which it's like if you're looking for like a list of like, do this thing in your design. I don't think that this is going to be the right, this isn't the right talk for you. If you just need that like list of tactics, I've sent along to Joran a specific paper. It's one of many, but it's super easy for you to Google, like, find these nudges. And I'm sending him an article written by Cass Sunstein, and it's got a fantastic handy reference point of nudges. But I want us to dig deeper, and I want us to get engaged in scientific thinking and to understand the theory and the frameworks of behavioral economics. I'm more interested in having you understand the theory and the framework so that you're not just sort of applying a tool, but rather you understand the philosophy. And I think that that's actually going to take you a lot further with BE than if I just rattle off kind of a list of these behavioral insights. So first of all, just to kind of cross off some of the issues around scientific thinking is like, as a designer and as an entrepreneur, and I think most of you are wearing at least those two hats, One of the key considerations is I want us to talk about how we use our language. First of all, is I want us to use hypotheses to drive our strategy, to change our kind of how we think about what it is we want to do, and to drive our internal planning even. It's instead of saying like, I think that, people will react to this by, like, that kind of language. Instead, just simple little tweak is to say, it's my hypothesis that this thing is true in the world. And then what we can do is, first of all, that offers a fundamental change in how we think. The first is like this assertion as if it's fact. And it's got this baggage around it, around our opinion, our ego, and it inhibits our ability to get feedback on this thing, because now if somebody wants to interact with you, even if that's yourself, you kind of get grounded in this, like, I think that, versus it's my intuition that such and such is true. It's my hypothesis that such and such is true. What that does is it allows us to kind of have this open space for, like, my mind could be changed by new evidence, or I'm in the process of gathering evidence to be able to take this intuition, this hypothesis, from this stage to something that is now fact or evidence. So I find this actually a place that gives you so much more power than if you are able to say it's my hypothesis that this thing is true. Your investors, your colleagues, the people who are going to help give tension on the ideas, because so many of you you're deep in this innovation space. It's actually going to help you solidify the ideas that you have and go deeper with your thinking, and to help establish a data-driven orientation. This is it's sort of like my public service announcement for scientific thinking, and it's so deeply embedded in what behavioral economics is all about. And I love to make sure that as entrepreneurs, as inventors, as designers, that make sure that you are grounding your own philosophy in the world and your own language with this scientific orientation. And let me make the connection now to behavioral economics, because it's actually that curiosity, that observation, that like willingness to say, I'm not so sure about, these fundamental assumptions and understanding that we have about the world. We need to question it. That questioning is what led to behavioral economics. So historical or traditional economics is based on this fundamental assumption that people are rational, that we're self-maximizing, that we always act in our best interest, that we have intentions and that we act on them, and that there's no say-do gap, and that we have willpower. It's all of this stuff. Basically, it's like we're these like perfect, awesome robots. You give an incentive, and that we should act in full accordance with that. You give information, people will act in accordance with that. That was the fundamental assumption that economics had. But the thing is, like, are we truly maximizers like robots? Do we actually have free will? And, by getting philosophical about human behavior, it might actually change how we see the world and how we design for it. But this isn't actually new. This won't be new to you. In the blockchain world, you're already familiar with how a philosophical insight can change your perspective on the world and how you design for it. Decentralization, it's your core tenet. It's a philosophical premise at the core of your design, which is along the lines of, trust is this very, very difficult thing to just assume and to rely on. And so therefore, it's in code we trust as the thing to replace that. But now we're at this paradoxical crossroads. How do we build a platform that reaches critical mass when not everybody is thinking philosophical about free will, or do we maximize our utility like robots, or the philosophical underpinnings of decentralization? So we're at this really interesting paradoxical crossroads, and so BE can actually help us with that. So it took a keen eye to actually start to unpack this this belief that we are fully rational beings. And it led to actually a Nobel Prize. It was a dish of cashews that led to behavioral economics. And a fellow by the name of Richard Thaler, who's listed in the book reference here, I think he was still a PhD student, and he had hosted like an economics meet and greet, discussion event at his house. He had some faculty over, some fellow students over, and he was making dinner for everyone. And before the dinner, he'd set out this like big bowl of cashews, and everyone was talking and just sort of munching away mindlessly on these cashews. And he thought kind of quietly to himself as he was thinking about his guests, he's like, I better take away these cashews because they're going to spoil their appetites. So he reaches in, he takes the bowl of cashews away, and suddenly this room full of economists starts to say, oh, thank you. Thanks for taking that away. And it was like, well, wait a second. We're a room full of economists, and what do you mean thank you for taking it away? Everything that we've ever done has been predicated on the assumption that people want more choice, people want more options, and that we can govern our own behavior. If I don't want the cashews, I won't eat them. But in fact, it turns out that human behavior doesn't act in accordance with that. We mindlessly eat. We give into temptation. The thing is there, it's suggested as a nudge. Somebody else's hand goes in to grab a few cashews. It's like it's a cue. And then I grab a few more. And then suddenly we've spoiled our appetite for what might have been a very delicious meal because we filled up on these cashews. So Richard Thaler pegged that as like, that contravenes everything that we know about economics. The moment that people started to say, thank you for taking away my choice, became this moment of like, what else is wrong with economics? Because they wouldn't have, a group of economists shouldn't have said, thank you for taking away my choice. These anomalies are what led to starting to kind of chip away what other fundamental assumptions about human behavior are wrong. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, when I think about blockchain and people who are the early adopters of Bitcoin and Ether and either these cryptocurrencies or this platform is, maybe it's true that we actually have a lot more people who are more rational actors. Maybe we do have people that are more driven by data in our world today. But the thing is, it's going to be a much bigger world that won't subscribe to the philosophy. The philosophy that we have, that the only thing that you can really trust in is in code, it's niche. And while we might want to be the educators and evangelizers for that philosophy, the other part of the world is actually fine. Just how do we build the products and solutions that actually leverage that principle? And so here we are. And so here you are, and actually trying to build this capability that now we need to make that shift between assuming that people will hear decentralization, be like, oh yeah, great, that makes total sense. Let me change how I do everything. Let me change how I bank. Let me change how I use money in the world, and so on. But that's not going to happen. So do we need to dig deep and get them to understand why blockchain is important? Or should we just get on with the process of making it easy to use blockchain-based technologies and solutions in the world? And I think I had one more thing, which is like, so we might want to choose to continue to hang on to that value proposition of decentralization like a Hippocratic oath, which is awesome. But at the same time, what I want to talk about is starting to make that transition where we fully appreciate that most, very, very few will get into it and actually care. So let's now actually get into behavioral economics. So one of the first principles that I want to talk about is BE is not saying that people are stupid. That's not what behavioral economics is saying. I'm not saying it's like you're either rational or you're irrational. That has very negative connotations to it. The book that Joran mentioned, right? Predictably irrational. The claim is not that. So either you're a robot or you're an irrational human being. That's that's a false dichotomy. What behavioral economics is saying is that we're boundedly rational. That won a Nobel Prize, this notion of boundedly rational. In the 1950s, Herbert Simon won a Nobel Prize for pointing out that it's actually that we're just limited. We're limited in time, in energy, in access to underlying data. Sometimes we're limited in our willpower. These are the things that have been built upon understanding, okay, so it's like if we're not robots, then what is it that's driving our behavior? Well, it's these constraints. And so that makes us boundedly rational. So as you think about your user group, what I'm asking you to do is to just operate on the assumption that people don't have unlimited time and energy to understand what it is that you're building and the why of it. I want you to factor in that some of your users will be like that, but most are boundedly rational. They're going to have limited time and energy to make those decisions. So instead of using this like really robust calculus to make decisions, instead what happens is, in the face of that limited time and information, we use heuristics to inform our decisions. We use heuristics to help shape our understanding about what's good and bad, what's high quality, what's low quality, what's easy, what's hard, or even our perception of that before we even use a thing. We're encoding that with lots of information. What's trustworthy and what's untrustworthy and what's a scam. We're encoding lots of our perception in these evaluative decisions. And I want you to understand the process by which people are making those evaluative decisions. So heuristics is the term that we use for these mental shortcuts for this evaluation. And one of the challenges with these heuristics is that they lead us to bias. So first, let me illustrate these concepts. So let's imagine like a scenario. I'm buying a car. So what are some of the different ways I can go about making my choice in buying a car? So on the one hand, I can, set up a spreadsheet. I can start to determine what are the variables that matter to me. Is it safety? Is it speed? Is it style? Is it the cost of the car? Is it the cost of running and operating the vehicle? So I can set up the spreadsheet, start to identify these variables, start to weight them based on my lifestyle and my needs. And then I could start the research journey, right? I can go to Consumer Reports. I can go to the National Highway Transportation Safety Authority to get that data. I can do lots of footwork to drive this research. So that's one way I can buy a car. And a lot of us make decisions like that sometimes. But and it makes a lot of sense to do that for a car. But there's a lot of domains where we don't do that. We don't do that for things like who our partner is. And we see things like a really high divorce rate as a consequence of people not using the spreadsheet in helping them make these decisions. It informs perhaps we don't think enough about what we're studying in university. We're not, or the career choices that we make. In other words, there's lots of really fundamental decisions where we should be using a spreadsheet, but we're not. We use it for things like TVs and cars, not these fundamental life decisions. So what is the other way that we then can make these decisions? So if we're not using a spreadsheet, what are we doing? We're either acting on our heart or our gut, to use kind of the colloquial terminology, or we use these heuristics, to use a fancy Greek term, to say, we do things like look in the environment. We look for cues to help guide our decisions. Again, we don't have unlimited time. And I'm not saying that using heuristics is a bad thing in and of itself. Just want us to understand the mechanisms that are driving that and what it looks like. So typical heuristics might be to just look around and see, okay, what's popular. Like, that's a pretty reasonable way to go about making a decision. If everybody else is doing it, generally we can assume that there's some rationale. We're inferring like other people have done this research, right? That's a reasonable inference to make. Or we look to experts. Like I have a friend who is an expert in cars. I might ask them about what is the best kind of car to buy. And again, it's pretty reasonable for me to go about looking to experts for their guidance. And so we have labels, right? We have labels for these two ways of thinking, right? The spreadsheet way of decision making, we call that system 2 decision making. And we have this other way, we call it the system 1 or type 1 decision making, and that's where we rely on heuristics. So first of all, there's an opportunity right in here for you to start to think about how are you presenting your user experience. You could start to automatically have a segmentation model for your users, and what assumptions are you making as the business leader and as the designer and the developer? What assumption are you making about your users? Are you assuming that they are using system 2 type decision making, which would mean that you're supporting their decision-making journey with things like information. How does this thing work? Giving them all the data that they need. Or maybe you're going a little bit further and you're providing education. You're providing a training and an onboarding, and you're taking that information and turning that into education. And you're operating on the assumption that if only they know, then they're going to do this thing. System 2 instead, or system 1 instead, actually recognizes that people are boundedly rational. They don't necessarily have the time, and instead they make their decision based on informational cues, either how they are responding to the environment or how social cues are influencing their decision making. But one of the things that we need to talk about heuristics is they're not necessarily always rational. They're not necessarily always the best guides to our decision making. So for instance, when we're relying on our own eyes, when we're looking to see, oh, what's the most popular thing out there in the world, we might actually be vulnerable to frequency illusion. So let's say if you're thinking about a car, what happens? Like suddenly we start to see that car everywhere we look, and we're like, oh yeah, I guess that car is really popular. And if that was one of the cues that we were looking for to making our decision, we might see, suddenly we're seeing this car all of the time and we think that they're really popular, and we think, therefore, we might infer that it's a really good car and it might be a good car for us. But this is a frequency illusion, which describes that experience where we have selective attention to something that we're looking for, and then it's just fueled by confirmation bias. That car was always seen, in the same distribution in the population as it was before, but now that your mind is attending to it, it seems as if it's far more common than it actually ever was. And that's one of the things that governs our misinterpretation and our statistical errors in how we see the world. We start searching for information in a way that confirms our own preconceptions. And that might make us think that something is more popular than it actually is. And so if we were using and relying on this heuristic of social proof, our own preconceived notion might actually misguide us in the reliability of that as a tool. We can say the same thing about experts. So my friend might seem like an expert in cars, but it might actually be his own overconfidence, and it's a halo effect that attracted me to sort of believing in his expertise that is actually falsely there. Or it might run the risk of him not declaring a conflict of interest. So he might seem like he has this expertise, but there might be an undisclosed conflict of interest. But if I'm just relying on experts prima facie at face value without digging deeper into how is that expertise justified, then my heuristic is guilty of being vulnerable to a bias. So as designers, then, we need to recognize that this is how people make decisions. We need to recognize that there are these type 1 and type 2 paths that we go on, and that both have these limitations. The type 1 is kind of has this risk of being exploited by bias, and then the type 2, its limit is bounded rationality. There's only so far we can go with information and education before people are going to check out. All right, let's just do a quick recap. Behavioral economics challenges the assumption of a rational agent. It supplements our rational agent with our boundedly rational agent who uses these heuristics and biases. And so this means, as a designer, you can apply this as a foundational segmentation model. So whether or not you've started to analyze your users, this is already a place where you can go, hey, how am I going to, what are my assumptions about my potential users of my service? So in the case of assuming you've got your decision makers, you can feed them with things like information and education through training. You can assume that they will respond rationally to incentives or economic taxes to either throttle or thwart behavior. But if we now look to system one, design, we need to leverage another groundbreaking insight from behavioral economics. And that is the fact that we can actually leverage our biases that I talked about before to actually lead us to better outcomes. So this is one of the cool things about behavioral economics, right? Like some of us might have heard like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with the fact that we have biases. Some of you might, be readers of Farnham Street, which is awesome. And he talks a lot about research that's based on our decision-making biases. But the thing about behavioral economics is we don't stop there at this cataloging of these biases and putting these descriptive labels on where we're making these judgment errors. Behavioral economics actually moves into something very practical, something very applied, which is how can we actually use these biases to shape behavior? And we call this process choice architecture. So let me give you an example. We have this bias called status quo. We tend to just want to kind of stick with things the way they are, even in the case where there might be free money on the table. Now remember, traditional economics might say, hey, free money, we're gonna jump, we're gonna want to hustle for that free money. But our real behavior through observations in the real world shows these anomalies, that we don't actually act consistently with that. Here's the example. I'm going to talk about retirement savings. Seems incredibly boring. You probably went like, ugh, even when I say retirement savings. And that's what happens to most people. So retirement savings is a benefit that many companies are able to provide employees. From a rational perspective, these retirement savings plans that employers provide employees gives them an economic advantage. Your salary goes not to your bank account, but instead goes to this retirement savings account. The tax rate is now exempt from your current tax rate and it is instead deferred to what your tax rate will be when you're retired, which is often significantly lower than what that tax rate would be at the salaried level. So it makes complete sense to defer some of that income to your retirement savings. And in fact, employers even sometimes sweeten the pot and will even put a match on there, guaranteed 100% return. Every dollar you put in there, they'll match a percentage of that. So not only do we have the benefit of a reduction in government clawing some of that money out, but second, we have this other benefit of some employers matching it. So you would think that the take-up rate of these programs would be to the max, right? Why wouldn't they be? And it turns out that that's not the case. In fact, generally participation rate when people are left to their own devices is on average, it's like 15 to 20%. They're very low take-up rates. Now, if you stop and you pause and you analyze and start to come up with your hypotheses about why this might be the case. Your intuition might be things like, well, people don't have a lot of money, they've got a lot of bills, they've got, maybe student debt to pay off, there's credit card interest that they want to deal with, lifestyle spending, houses are expensive. You might start to go into this kind of rationale. Well, another thing you might think about is just that human experience. That human experience of dealing with retirement savings. Just saying those two words together already makes most of us go like, ugh. It's an unpleasant topic area. Let's think about that now at scale with employees when they, picture this like thick manila envelope. There's all these forms, they're filled with things that we don't understand. Employees are asked to make these choices about which investment vehicle and what percentage of their salary and how they want to do their asset allocation. It's like, people don't know what this stuff is. And yet we're expecting them to enroll in these programs, sign up for all of these things, and away we go. And it turns out that as I said, they're very low participation rates. So what can we do about it? Well, a typical approach would be to do an education seminar, right? Just educate people. They don't understand like all the tax benefits stuff that I rattled off, right? So maybe once you teach people about the tax benefits and how all of this works, then surely that'll get more people to sign up. Well, it's awesome. A field experiment was done on just that question. So, the hypothesis is like give people more education and they will more likely to enroll in these plans. A study was done with thousands of employees across several locations where some were given this great education seminar on how to enroll, why to enroll, the benefits of enrolling, all of that. And then another group was in the control condition. Well, they did the education seminar, and at the end of the session, they asked the attendees, are you going to enroll in a retirement savings program? And what's your intuition about how many people said, yes, I am going to enroll? So your intuition might be, as is often the case, like most people say, yeah, I think 75%, 80%, most of us will say, after a really robust investment seminar, I bet you're able to drive enrollment. And it turns out that that's true. About between 80 and 90% of people say, yes, I am going to enroll in retirement savings right away. Now, in this study, what was done was people's behavior was observed for 6 months. And we were able to see that 10% of the people who were in the education seminar and actually enrolled, helping us to see and provide light to this massive say-do gap. So education doesn't necessarily change behavior. Well, let's go back to some of the fundamental premises that we've learned so far about behavioral economics, which is, well, what are people's biases? Well, when it comes to retirement savings, status quo bias, keeping things the way they are, is a huge barrier. A second barrier that we have is that people are very afraid of making an error of commission versus an error of omission. Let me explain that a little bit further. You see, when you ask employees if they're going to enroll in the retirement savings program, often they'll say yes, as we found, and then they just say tomorrow is their answer. Not right now, tomorrow. So they procrastinate. So we have this thing of procrastination. Well, what drives procrastination? One of the things is actually fear of making a mistake. So instead of making the mistake today, actively, like choosing the wrong investment vehicle, picking the wrong asset allocation, choosing the wrong amount, I say, I'm going to get to that tomorrow, which is an error of omission, not acting. So you have to recognize that people are more afraid of intentionally making a mistake than they are of just procrastinating and delaying. It seems like, well, I was too busy. It's this external factor that led me to not enrolling in the program, not something that I hands-on did, made a mistake myself in making the wrong choices. Okay, so this is the problem. So behavioral economics, first it gave us this diagnosis, right? We talked about, well, there's status quo bias, there's this error of commission being more painful than an error of omission. So what can we do about it? One of the things that has been tried to tremendous success is actually using defaults. Default people in to retirement savings program. Why wait for them to enroll in the program? If you already know that the retirement savings program is more beneficial to your employees, if you're offering the benefit, why would you wait for them to enroll in it? And if you already know what that participation rate is and it's so low, what else can you try? It's not more flyers, it's not more awareness, it's not more education. Instead, why don't we default the employees into the program with the option to opt out of the program? So you're still maintaining that autonomy of choice, but instead you're putting people into the program right away. And what happens? What happens is you end up with 75% to as highest that I've seen is 93% of employees stay enrolled in the retirement savings program, thereby gaining the benefits of the program. As a libertarian, you haven't taken away people's choice. They could still opt out. There's a percentage of folks who need to do something else with their money besides stay enrolled in a retirement savings program. Behavioral economics is all about understanding where those biases are and then leveraging the fact that if you put this default in, what do you get? You get status quo bias. So many people say, well, tomorrow I'm going to look more carefully at this retirement savings program that I'm in. Tomorrow I'm going to look. Well, in the time that it takes for them to get around to actually analyzing the program, they've actually been enrolled and enjoying those benefits all along. So this is how you can actually leverage behavioral economics. So this power of default had this huge sway on the number of people enrolled. And we call this choice architecture. But I have to stop for a second and I have to talk about ethics, because behavioral economics is in fact that powerful. You can in fact sway the choices that people make. You're defaulting people into retirement savings. Like, we can think about that and go, wait a second, the guy would have been earning whatever, $1,000 a week. Now you're shifting 5% or 10% of that money away into this long-term savings. Maybe the guy's got, high credit card debt he needs to be dealing with. Are we really making the right choice for people? That's the ethics of behavioral economics that we need to consider. And in fact, we do see some backfiring effects. We do see, for instance, if you ask any financial advisor, they're going to be telling you you should be saving at least like 10% of your income. Like, that's kind of that, the basic kind of a simple heuristic or golden rule is at least 10% of your income should be saved. Well, let's go back to this retirement savings program thing. You have to default people in at some amount. Are they defaulting people in at 10%? No. It turns out that typically what employers are defaulting employees in at is numbers like 2%. That's not even going to keep up with inflation. So it's an inadequate savings amount. And then the other default choice that has to be made is what investment vehicle people are being invested in. And I'm assuming that some of you have got financial knowledge. You know that there's different sort of risk adjusted return portfolios that different people can take. It's very different for an employee who's maybe in their later stage years. Something that's very conservative is appropriate. And if you think about maybe someone who's younger, they should have something that's got more potential upside, because we can kind of do dollar cost averaging over time. But the typical program doesn't do that. It takes a very, very, very conservative approach, which is good for some, but not good for all. So now you've got this power of these defaults kind of creating this backfiring effect on what's actually in the best interest of the employee. We're assuming that they're going to go in and reallocate to a higher percentage, getting them closer maybe to that 10%. We're assuming that they're going to go back in and do a reallocation of their portfolio to something that matches the risk that they ought to be taking. But we see that they don't. And so there's more work to do to then put a nudge on top of a nudge. Now, the good thing is people are in something versus nothing, but we need to take into consideration the fact that whose best interest, who's the beneficiary of the nudge? Is it you or is it the consumer? And these are the ethical questions that we have to ask about behavioral economics. I want to give you another example of how powerful behavioral economics is by picking up on the example that I gave earlier of this element of social proof. This is a really cool study that was done by Duncan Watts. He wrote a book called Everything is Obvious Once You Know the Answer. And I put that in the notes for Joran. So in this case, he had set up and his fellow colleagues set up a thing called the Music Lab. And they were curious about what is the impact of ratings and downloads, absolute number, and then these subjective and relative ratings on people's preferences for music. Now, again, our intuition would say, well, I know what kind of music I like. I know what I would download. I know a good song from a bad song. I've got my preference, and my musical taste and my downloads would sort of follow in accordance with that. I shouldn't be, I won't be swayed by what you think is popular. I know what I like. Well, it actually turns out that this element of social proof has a huge effect on something as seemingly objective as our own preferences. They ran this really cool study where, first of all, they had 100 songs. They put them in this database. They were all new songs, so they kind of didn't have any history behind them. And then they took a bunch of different sources to kind of figure out, let's say that these 100 songs are, one of them is titled Apples and one of them is titled kind of Zucchini, and we'll use that as a crude metaphor. And then they found out what are the most popular songs. And across this database, there was it was blind. And they subjected, thousands of people to kind of pick through these songs. And they found out, Apples was generally the most popular song, Bananas was the second one, Carrots the third, and so on. But then they developed this kind of social world. We'll call it the social world version. And what they did was they preloaded the music lab. Imagine sort of seeing like Spotify. And here you could see people's rating of the song, like, oh, this is an awesome song, super popular. And you could see the amount of downloads that it already had. And the download number was really high. But what they did was they took that first kind of neutral environment, and when they populated in the social world, they inverted the order. So the song that was actually the least popular, they made it look as if it was the most popular song that everybody loved with the most amount of downloads, and so on. So they inverted that order. And then they watched. Then they watched the real participants come in and see what they judged as the best songs and which ones they downloaded. And it turns out that people would conform to this inverted world. The song that was actually considered the worst song now became the most popular song, the second most popular, and so on. So this influence of other people's evaluation of what is good and what is popular can be highly influenced by the power of social suggestion. But you can only go so far. It turns out over time, eventually the best song ended up emerging to the top, and the worst song ultimately ended up back on the bottom. So you can only go so far with shaping people's preference before the wisdom of crowds ends up taking over. That said, you have this incredible power of social contagion that can impact and influence the amount of drive that people have and what they see as something that is, good or useful in the world. So now let me just step back for a second, and I want to lay behavioral economics out as a three-part framework. We've talked about this diagnosing of biases, this understanding of your user group, understanding of how they make decisions, segmenting based on this sort of rational decision maker versus this one that uses these heuristics and is vulnerable to these biases. I call this the behavioral diagnostics phase. The second part of our three-part framework is this choice architecture phase. This is impacting and influencing people's decision-making processes by using these nudges, such as defaults and social proof, as I've talked about so far, as ways to impact and influence people's behavior. And then last but not least, it's using experimentation as a way to validate our hypotheses, or more accurately, it's like to test and subject our intuition about what's true in the world, subject that to experimentation to actually falsify our intuition. And that is the role of experiments and generating evidence to falsify our perception about what's true in the world. All right. So I just want to start to just touch now briefly kind of my final part of the notes that I had prepared for you. I want to now just do an application of that to technology adoption. There's a framework called the technology adoption model, and it's useful because in its origins, what it did was it looked at what are the attractors, what attracts people to a technology. And two of the kind of key components are people's perception of the usefulness, like what utility will I derive from this thing? And then secondarily, what will be the friction of this or the cost of it? So we talked about the benefits, and then the other side is what is the cost of it? So one of the elements of that cost equation would be how easy is it to use? How much friction will there be? So we've got these two perceptual dynamics of the utility of the benefits and the perception of the utility of the cost. But it turns out, we're not so simple. There's a lot of other things in this calculus that you need to take into consideration. And that is things like people's attitudes towards technology, their attitudes or their perception towards your service. And I wanted to just address 3 of those potential barriers and then give you some choice architecture things to keep in mind in your design to hopefully get them to adopt this probably amazing technology that you're building. So first of all, we need to take into consideration people's perception of risk. That risk is like, will this service be useful? Is it a scam? Will I lose my money? Will I waste my time? Just these various aspects of the perception of risk. One of the things that we can do to kind of counter that perception of risk is help increase people's sense of self-efficacy. And I think that this is a really awesome concept in the blockchain world. I think that probably there might be some folks who are here with us who go to Burning Man. And there's one of the principles of Burning Man is radical self-reliance. And it's a wonderful ethos that burners share with people in the blockchain community. We assume that people will enter the world with a high degree of radical self-reliance, or in the psychological construct, we call that self-efficacy. But what can we do to increase self-efficacy with people who are sort of nervous and new to the technology? Well, there's some simple things that we can do to help increase that sense. So one of them is to help facilitate a sense of mastery, to help give people a sense of like they understand what this technology is actually all about, and to rely on some of those techniques, not just information, but education, but not just education by itself. Give people feedback and break things down into baby steps, and then give them visual cues that they are using the technology in the right way. You might remember Dropbox when it first launched. It kind of had these kind of 10 things that you needed to do to become a Dropbox user. And it was like, connect this, do a referral there, take each of these steps, and you're on your way to mastering Dropbox. And they broke those steps down in a very discrete way. So for those of you doing things like building cryptocurrency wallets and you're worried about people, doing proper key management, break those things down into very, very discrete steps before they actually start to use the wallet. I would think that the Dropbox model is a really useful metaphor for how you can create this self-efficacy and this feeling of self-efficacy. And what's really interesting about self-efficacy is like the more you're able to increase that feeling of self-efficacy, the more their perceived enjoyment and their own perceived utility of the service actually goes up. The second one that I wanted to talk about was lack of trust. So what can we do in the face of lack of trust? So there's been some very interesting research on this issue using this thing called operational transparency. And there's a really counterintuitive insight around operational transparency. So for instance, when the banks first started to introduce computer banking, people's satisfaction with the bank actually went down. Transaction speed went up, reliability went up, but people's satisfaction with the bank went down. People could see, there was this really interesting study that was run, people could see the tellers kind of keying in information and then kind of sitting there and waiting for something to happen. And it would seem as if the teller was doing nothing. She was just sitting there, or she or he was just sitting there just watching this thing. And so people's perception of the value actually went down, which is not what the bank wanted. They wanted to be seen as innovative. And it turns out that when they actually shifted the screen so that people could see the data processing, the perception of the utility of the computer went up, and the satisfaction with the overall experience also went up. There's a second example, just to reinforce this point, with a really wonderful study that was done with kayak.com. Kayak is one of these travel sites, and you punch in, I want to make a trip from Toronto to LA, what are my flight options, and you could get the results back just like this. Here's the cheapest flight, and the results would come back like this. But what is the perception of utility? What is the perception of value that the user gets when the answers come back just like this? Well, it turns out counterintuitively that by slowing down the results process, people's perception of the value of the search engine actually went up. In fact, by showing kind of this almost like this, like the spinning wheel, like the computer is thinking, and having like logs go by and transaction records, we're crunching through tons of data, like even though the computer could go like this, instead showing the effort by the computer in a parallel to the same way of showing effort by the teller, showing the computer is doing this work, actually led to greater perception of value, greater satisfaction in the experience. Now, who would think a transaction actually going slower would increase people's sense of trust? But now there's this perception of like, oh, I see that this thing is like sweating it out for me and doing work on my behalf. So for you, what are the things that you can do to create that transparency about how the service is doing the work? What can you do to show the labor, show the sweating behind the transaction? And then last but not least, I just wanted to circle back to status quo. And what are the things that we can do to overcome status quo bias? So it's incredibly difficult to change people's behavior, but we're at such a period of disruption, not only from COVID-19 and the public policy mandates that we're all hopefully adhering to, but there's just other forms of disruption that technology brings to us all of the time. And those disruptions allow us these like breaks in continuity in our behavior, these breaks in our habits. And when we see a break in habit, that's when we have the opportunity to introduce something new, to use social proof, to help create this self-efficacy, these key moments in people's lives, to introduce a new way of doing things. So I want you to take into consideration how and when people are doing things as moments of truth where you can actually fundamentally change behavior. So with that, I hope that I have given you some insights, some first principles about behavioral economics, some strategies and tactics that you can try to impact and influence people's behavior and adoption of this incredible technology. So thank you so much.
That was amazing. My mind is blown by the amount of information you had packed in that presentation. I'm 100% bookmarking this, and I already know I need to rewatch it and take some more notes. I was trying to take some notes while you were going through, but so fascinating, what motivates people to make the decisions they make. And I think like a huge part of that in blockchain is like this game theory part of it, but like you just went like so many more layers deep into game theory that I need to peel that onion back apart and take a look at it again. Thank you so much for that, Kelly. We have some great questions here to go through. I want to ask one of my own before we get into those questions. You mentioned that party where they with the cashew bowl and they took that away. So in blockchain, there are so many different options. Of course, we have Bitcoin, Ethereum, the big grandfathers of the space, but there are like more than 7,000 different blockchains and coins and tokens and projects out there. So is the onus on us as developers to kind of weed that out and take away some of those options and condense down to a few, just a few options? Like, what is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, one of the things that we need to take into consideration is this phenomenon known as choice overload. And there was a study, it didn't replicate, so I want to just disclose that, but nevertheless, it still has this intuitive strength to it. And we do see it manifest in other domains. I'll give you the study that didn't replicate, but the ones that have are more time consuming, and I'll reference those. But I do want you to know this one didn't replicate, but nevertheless, the underlying theory is still valid in many cases and not all, and more work needs to be done, but it's good fodder for this group. Choice overload was first tested, again, back to this, you think that people want more choices. So a study was led by Sheena Nayangar, where they worked in a grocery store and they had these like jams and jellies. And you would think that as a consumer, if a store is pitching you on buying their brand of jams and jellies, you'd want the customer to see, oh, you've got all these different flavors. But they had this hypothesis, like, isn't there a point when people have just choice overload? And as a consequence of choice overload, instead of picking one of your flavors, instead they do nothing. Obviously, that's a hell of a hypothesis. If you're building a thing, and our intuition is like, oh, let's build, and I think it's really interesting in a new industry when you're like, oh, we've got so many micro markets and micro segments and different groups, and let's appeal to this group and this group and this group and this group, and we'll have this flavor and that flavor. And there's a risk. There's a risk of this phenomenon of choice overload. And let me talk to you about what they found. What happened in the original study was they ran the experiment where they just had 6 flavors of the jams and jellies. And then they had another condition where they had 24 of the flavors. Now, one of the things that they measured was how many people did the taste test when they had the 6 and it's these little things, with the pop-up thing, and the person standing there is like, oh, do you want to try my jelly? And then do you want a coupon to buy the jelly? Like, that's the gist of how this thing worked. So in one version, they had the 6 flavors and the coupons, and then they could see how many people actually took the jar and went and bought it because they got the coupon, so they knew. They had nice data for a nice experiment. And then they had the same thing. This time they whipped out the 24 flavors, and it was controlled in different times of day and different stores, and all that good stuff was cross-referenced for those of you who've designed experiments. So it turns out that in the condition where there were 6 flavors versus 24 flavors, there was a significant difference in the number of people who actually bought a jelly. And that's what matters. That's actually what matters here. So you might think on the one hand, give people more choice, but in fact, the actual significant volume was driven when we had fewer choices. Now, there are different ways that we can design around that. We can use simple things like clustering like ones together and then creating a triage mechanism. It's like, so instead the choice is like, do you want sugar or sugar-free? Okay, the sugar-free people know that they need the sugar-free, so away they go. Now within that, you can do a next level of bifurcation. So in fact, instead of being confronted with 24, instead you're now looking at doing things like a visual display where it's like, this color is this, that color label is that, and now I can pick like the color label that I'm interested in and start to triage my decision making in that way. So we need to recognize that choice overload is a very powerful phenomenon that dissuades any action, or we need to load on these other heuristics to help people instead of feeling overwhelmed and becoming paralyzed. We need to do other things to help nudge that choice. It's the same thing that happens in the investment world. When you present people with like, you can have this mutual fund and this mutual fund and this mutual fund and that one and that one and that one and that one, it turns out that people either make no decision at all, or they operate on making the decision on things that is superfluous. Like, well, I like the name of that investment vehicle more than I like the name of that one. And those are not good, rational decision-making criteria.
That's amazing. Yeah, I totally resonate with that. And something comes to mind when you talk about that subject is like analysis paralysis, where there's like so many options, you just like want to analyze it, and then you're like, I'll do it tomorrow. That's amazing. Thank you so much for that answer. We have some great questions here from the audience, so I'm just going to start going down the list. And remember, folks, if you're watching, you can go into this questions list and you can upvote certain questions if you think you want to get that answers, because I'm not sure if we'll get through all of these, but there's some really great ones that I see here. So first one on the top of the list we have, how does like FOMO, the fear of missing out role, influence our decisions? It's not necessarily rational, but it's a very human trait.
It's huge. Yeah, so FOMO manifests itself. One of the terms when you want to dig deeper into this is to look for scarcity effect. And we see that marketers use this all of the time. They'll say limited time only as a way to drive sales. And it picks up on another thing labeled loss aversion, the fear of missing out, or that fear of losing out on something, is a very powerful motivator in terms of people's behavior that will potentially get them to act impulsively and before they might have made a full decision on something. So again, these are the psychological taxes that we can use to impact and influence behavior. And I say a psychological tax. We're used to thinking about economics. We're used to thinking about fees, which is an economic tax, or prices as an economic tax. Well, there's also these psychological taxes, which is things like fear, regret, guilt, shame. These are all forces of psychological tax that can be used, hopefully for good. Hopefully we're using these things to get people to save, or to get people to make a transition to something that is in their best interest. I'm assuming that we're using these things for ethical outcomes in the best interest of our customer. But FOMO is a very powerful psychological phenomenon that is classic tool by marketers.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Okay, what's the next question here? Are there traps and pitfalls that you've noticed that designers particularly fall into when designing for blockchain products and services?
Oh man, I wish I knew the answer to that. And I'm afraid this is my last question because I have to go to help one of our ministries work with vaccine uptake. So I've got to pop over to that call. I wish I knew the answer to that question. I'm so excited about the development in blockchain. I'm excited about the different apps that are being built for everything from protecting the integrity of the supply chain. I love the work that's being done on developing new identity solutions. I love some of the really cool apps like one of the early ones was a distributed music platform. The name escapes me right now, but it was one of the first ones where you could buy music completely out of the typical sort of Hollywood, an LA distribution chain. So I'm very excited about the inventions, and I think that behavioral economics could be a very powerful tool set for you. I think my intuition, and I could be wrong, it's my intuition that I think and that's why I talked about first principles. My intuition is that from a first principles perspective, my intuition is that we're assuming that we always have the rational the non-bounded, the unbounded actor as our consumer. It's my intuition that we are acting as if we give people the right amount of information, and we give people just straight up the incentives, that they are acting in accordance with that. And what I am suggesting through my talk is that we need to look at the tools from psychology that look at behavior that could be very, very powerful at helping drive better design and lead to stronger adoption and get scale of the thing that you're building, so we can get to the revolution and transformation of society and the economy from blockchain that I am dreaming about. So
Wow.
Thank you very much.
That's an amazing point. We're so sad to see you go. We wish we could pick your brain on more topics, but we understand you got some crucial work to get to. So we thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. I'm definitely going to rewatch this video. I feel like there's so many nuggets that I could that to catch on some more. But so yeah, thank you very much, Kelly. If you need to jet out, we understand. We're just going to wrap up here. But thank you again.
Awesome. And check out our stuff, BEworks, and social media. I'm on Twitter. I'm there. Kelly BEworks is my Twitter handle. And, got some TEDx talks online and a few other resources. And then through BEworks.com and our LinkedIn as well and our Twitter site, we try to share some of the awesome research that's happening out there. And if anyone is open to doing randomized control tests, using proper experiments, please let us know. That's the best way that we can employ and test and develop our research. So thank you.
That's awesome. Where would we sign up to do that?
Just reach us through just right in through the website. So info@beworks.com. Flag just flag that this was the Bitcoin Bay talk. That was where we met, and we can go from there.
Amazing. Cool. Sounds super exciting. All right. Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thanks, everyone.
See you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. All right, folks. Well, there you have it. You can always rewatch this video. It's going to be posted immediately after we finish the live on our Crowdcast. And so sorry we didn't get to answer your questions, but reach out through the channels, follow her on Twitter, check out their website, and hopefully we can get an answer to your questions there. Amazing. I'm checking out the polls there. So a lot of folks didn't know about it today, but I think we can all say we learned a lot about behavioral economics. And moving forward, I definitely am going to be using these tactics and looking at a little bit deeper on how we can use these in our projects. So we have another workshop a little bit later on today. It's an intro to developing on Bitcoin Cash with Jerry. So that's going to be super cool to look forward to. And we also have another workshop from the BEworks team. Matthew Can is going to be doing a talk on designing a better onboarding experience using behavioral economics. So that is going to be super exciting. Take a look at our schedule. You can see it all on the portal.blockhack.ca. You'll find the schedule there and you can check out when that is happening. Super cool. Awesome. Thank you so much, Ed, for dropping Kelly's Twitter handle there. So make sure you guys give her a follow. And there's one more thing that I'm going to ask you folks is we always want to continue to improving our talks and workshops. So if you would be so kind to check out the form here I just posted in the chat, head on over there, give us, let us know which workshop you saw and rate our workshop and give us any feedback that you think we could use to improve our process. But I think that is it for this session. Tune in again in about just under 6 hours. We have our next workshop with Jerry coming up, intro to Bitcoin Cash development. So until then, folks, I'll see you later.